At a high society wedding, a single drop of water sparked a $57,000 scandal. But the real explosion came after the red wine. A mother-in-law humiliated in front of 300 guests decides to fight back, not with drama, but with the one thing her enemies never saw coming: forensic accounting and a lifetime of secrets. This is not just a revenge story. It's a tale of power, family, betrayal, and how one woman took down a billion-dollar criminal empire with nothing but truth, grit, and a wine-stained dress. Watch till the end. You won't believe how it all unfolds, because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the cards. Let us know in the comments, would you forgive? What would you have done in her shoes? It was supposed to be the most beautiful day of my son's life. A glittering celebration in a world of white roses and vintage champagne. Instead, in a single moment, it became the scene of my quietest, coldest promise. I can still see it. The reception hall glowing with soft candlelight, the string quartet sliding into another delicate waltz, guests in gowns and tuxedos moving like chess pieces across polished marble floors. I had just finished telling a story about David as a little boy, how he once brought home a stray puppy and tried to hide it under his bed, when a single droplet of water slipped from my glass onto the hem of Vanessa's dress. One drop, barely visible. I gasped and reached for my napkin to blot it, murmuring apologies, the way any decent person would, and then I saw it. That flicker, that quick, cold glint in her eyes, the kind you catch from a predator just before it strikes. Before I could react, Vanessa tilted her wine glass and, as if startled, sent an entire river of Bordeaux cascading down the front of my rented gown. The sound of 100 people inhaling at once is something you never forget. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Forks hovered above plates. My $50,000 rental gown, the one she'd so generously insisted on for me, bloomed into a crimson map of humiliation. Beads and silk drank the wine like blood. "Oh no," she cried, a hand flying to her mouth in theatrical horror. "I'm so clumsy when I'm startled." Her voice was just loud enough to carry across the hall. "Accidents happen, just like yours, of course." The room chuckled nervously, unsure whether to laugh or look away, but I wasn't laughing. Because I'd seen the split second before the spill. This was no accident, this was a performance, a power move. I straightened, smoothed my skirt as if I were brushing off dust instead of ruin, and smiled, the kind of smile you give someone who thinks they've already won. "Don't worry about it, darling," I said, my voice clear and calm. "Accidents do happen. Though I have to say, the rental company is going to be very upset. $50,000 is a lot of money even for an accident." The hall went utterly still. I could feel eyes on my back as I walked out through the garden doors, wine dripping from silk, dignity trailing behind me like a cloak. By the time I reached my car, my hands were trembling, not just with anger, but with clarity. Vanessa Ashford had just made the biggest mistake of her privileged life. She'd assumed I was harmless. She'd assumed I would clean up, smile politely, and fade quietly into the background of her glittering new world. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I closed the car door, took one long breath, and let my professional instincts settle over me like armor. 30 years as a forensic accountant had taught me one immutable truth. Every empire leaves a paper trail, and the higher the tower of wealth, the darker the shadow underneath. I had spent a career untangling offshore accounts and phantom companies, finding the threads rich people never wanted anyone to pull. That night, sitting in my car in the glow of the dashboard, I didn't cry. I didn't even curse. I just stared at my hands, still shaking from the adrenaline, and began making a mental list. 3 months from that night, Vanessa would learn exactly what happens when you humiliate a woman who spent 3 decades following other people's secrets. But before I could pull her family's empire apart, brick by brick, You need to understand how we arrived at this moment, because the devil, as they say, is in the details. 6 months earlier, my son David had stood in my kitchen, his eyes shining, and announced his engagement to Vanessa Ashford. Even then, something about her unsettled me, not her beauty. She was stunning in that polished way money can buy. But the way she looked at me, like I was an outdated piece of furniture that didn't match the decor. At the time, I smiled and said all the right things. I told myself maybe I was being judgmental, maybe I was just protective. But as the months passed and the wedding plans spiraled into a spectacle of imported flowers, celebrity photographers, and a dress rental that cost more than some people's cars, I began to understand. This wedding wasn't just about love, it was about power. And power is something I've learned to recognize. So when that glass of wine hit my dress on that perfect afternoon, when my humiliation became her spectacle, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had just chosen the wrong person to humiliate, and she would never see the ending coming. Stay with me, because this story isn't just about a ruined dress. It's about how far one woman will go when you back her into a corner, about family secrets, about revenge served not in rage but in strategy. It's about how you dismantle an empire without firing a shot. And before this story is over, you'll see exactly how I did it. 6 months before that glass of wine shattered my dignity, the first cracks were already forming, though I didn't know it at the time. "Mom," David said, practically glowing as he stirred cream into his coffee, "I proposed to Vanessa last night. She said yes." I blinked, forcing a smile, even as something inside me went still. I'd only met Vanessa twice before, once at a charity gala and once over dinner at my house. She'd been polite, poised, stunning in a designer dress I couldn't pronounce, and heels worth more than my mortgage payment. But there was something about her, something I couldn't name yet, something cold. Still, I did what any mother would do. I congratulated my son, hugged him tightly, and asked when I'd get to congratulate his fiancée in person. He smiled, the kind of smile you only get when you're deeply, irrevocably in love. "Soon," he said. "We're thinking a summer wedding. Her family's estate is available that weekend. You'll love it." Her family. That was the next red flag, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. "Mom," David added, "Vanessa's family owns Ashford Industries. You know, the shipping company?" Oh, I knew. Any accountant worth her salt did. Ashford Industries wasn't just a shipping company. It was a billion-dollar dynasty with interests in logistics, real estate, offshore investments, and, as I would later discover, a few things far less respectable. Old money. The kind that doesn't whisper. It roars. The kind that doesn't just pass wealth down through generations. It passes down power, influence, secrets. At the time, I said nothing more than, "I've heard of them," and left it at that. But inside, I felt a shift. My son, the boy I'd raised on homemade pasta and thrift store jeans, was stepping into a world that played by different rules. And I had a sinking feeling he didn't know the game. The first family dinner confirmed my worst fears. Vanessa's parents were charming, in that smooth, unbothered, perfectly practiced way that people with generational wealth often are. Her father, Richard Ashford, exuded confidence like cologne. Her mother, Lorraine, barely looked at me, except to compliment the quaint charm of my brooch. Vanessa, for her part, played the perfect hostess, but her eyes, they scanned the room constantly, like she was checking for dust on a priceless vase. When she looked at me, it wasn't warm, it wasn't even polite. It was dismissive, like I was the help who had spoken out of turn. Still, I stayed silent. I told myself it was nerves or stress, or maybe my own insecurity, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Then came the wedding planning, and if I'd had any illusions about Vanessa before, they shattered within a week. "The venue," she said over brunch, "has to be the Ritz. Anything less would feel provincial. She said it without a hint of irony, sipping lavender lemonade from a crystal flute. The flowers should be flown in from Belgium, she continued, and we'll need a photographer who's worked at Cannes. I want the photos to feel like a Vogue spread, not a family reunion. David nodded along, clearly overwhelmed but smitten, and then she turned to me, flashing that polished smile. Margaret, she said, you simply must wear something spectacular, something that says regal. Daddy and I found a couture rental. It's divine. Only $50,000 for the weekend. I nearly choked on my tea, but she waved it off like it was a Groupon deal. Consider it our gift to you, she said. You'll be family after all. I wanted to refuse. I should have. But saying no would have made David uncomfortable, and I wasn't ready to start a war. So I nodded, smiled, and said, "Thank you. That's very generous." Inside, I felt like I was being swallowed by a world that looked beautiful on the outside, but had rot beneath the surface. The next few months were a blur of fittings, tastings, floral consultations, and photo shoots, none of which I'd asked for. Vanessa orchestrated every detail like a military campaign. David drifted further into her orbit, slowly becoming someone I didn't quite recognize. He started using phrases like legacy planning and market adjacency. He wore cufflinks. He stopped talking about his dream of opening his own ad agency and started talking about aligning with the Ashford vision. And through it all, I stayed quiet. I smiled. I helped pick tablecloths. I played my role until the day of the wedding, until the wine, until that moment when the mask slipped and I saw the truth. Vanessa didn't see me as family. She saw me as disposable. And that is when I decided to show her exactly how dangerous a disposable woman can be. The morning of the wedding was perfect. Of course it was. The sky was blue enough to break hearts. The breeze smelled like roses, and the estate looked like something out of a royal documentary. It was everything Vanessa had wanted. No expense spared, no detail overlooked. A quartet played Bach in the marble courtyard while guests sipped champagne. Waiters in crisp white coats carried trays of amuse-bouches I couldn't pronounce. Even the flower petals scattered down the aisle had been imported from somewhere exotic. I stood in front of a full-length mirror in a private room of the Ashford estate, smoothing down the beaded silk of my $50,000 rental gown. It felt like wearing someone else's life, heavy, stunning, and completely unnatural. Still, I had to admit, I looked regal. I walked into the crowd like a woman who belonged, because if I'd learned anything in my 30 years as a forensic accountant, it was this. Power respects appearances, and in this world, appearance was power. The ceremony went off without a hitch. David looked heartbreakingly handsome. Vanessa glowed like a diamond. Guests cried, photographers circled, vows were exchanged under a floral arch that had cost more than my car. And just like that, I had a new daughter-in-law. At the reception, I floated from conversation to conversation, glass of water in hand, smile perfectly rehearsed. I laughed at small talk, accepted compliments on my dress, and told a few charming stories about David's childhood. It was during one of those stories that it happened. I was describing David's third-grade science fair, the baking soda volcano year, when a drop of water slipped from my glass and landed on the hem of Vanessa's gown. One drop, barely visible, practically nothing. I gasped immediately, horrified. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry," I said, reaching for my napkin. "Let me blot it." Vanessa looked down, then up at me. For a moment, just a moment, I saw it. Cold, calculating, a flicker of something intentional. Then her expression shifted, faster than I could blink, and she gasped, took a theatrical step back, and whoops, her hand slipped. A full glass of red wine cascaded down the front of my gown. It hit like blood on snow. The entire reception turned. Silence fell like the moment before a thunderclap. My $50,000 gown, now soaked in Bordeaux, clung to me like a joke. Vanessa gasped again, pressing her manicured hand to her mouth. "Oh no," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm so clumsy when I'm startled. I'm so sorry, Margaret." I met her eyes, and I knew this wasn't an accident. This was theater, a performance, a power move. She wanted to humiliate me, to remind me, in front of 300 people, that I didn't belong in her world, that her money, her name, her status, all of it, could erase me with a single gesture. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly understand, is that I don't break. I bend, I observe, I calculate, I smiled. A calm, deliberate, terrifying smile. "Don't worry about it, darling," I said, my voice cutting clean through the stunned silence. "Accidents happen." I let the words hang in the air for a beat too long. Though, I added casually, I have to say the rental company is going to be very upset. $50,000 is quite a bit, even for an accident. Gasps, whispered speculation, flashing cameras, and Vanessa, frozen mid-performance, unsure how to respond. I turned, gathered what was left of my dignity, and walked out through the garden exit. Red wine dripping behind me like a trail of war paint. By the time I reached my car, I was shaking, not from embarrassment, from rage, from clarity. That moment, that exact moment, changed everything. Vanessa had just made the biggest mistake of her privileged life. She assumed I was some harmless middle-class woman who would disappear quietly after being put in her place. But what she didn't know is that I spent 30 years tracking criminals, exposing fraud, and following money trails the average person couldn't even see. I wasn't just some woman in a fancy dress. I was a forensic accountant with a memory like a steel trap, professional contacts in every major agency, and absolutely nothing left to lose. And now I had a reason to look into the Ashfords, not as a mother-in-law, but as an investigator. This wasn't going to be about revenge, not really. This was going to be about consequences. The wine was the match, and I was about to burn down their empire. Back in the quiet of my home office, that wine-stained gown hanging like a warning in my closet, I set my jaw and opened my laptop. I knew the game had begun, and I intended to win. I had always believed that power was never given, only revealed. And that day, Vanessa had exposed her hand. The question now was, how many cards had she already stacked against me? I started simply with what I knew best: numbers, corporate filings, financial statements. 30 years as a forensic accountant had taught me to see what others overlooked: shell entities, unexplained flows, corporate veils that hide much more than they reveal. I tipped my coffee mug aside and lined up documents on the desk: the Ashford Industries annual reports, publicly filed SEC forms, stock ownership charts, subsidiaries listed by name only. On the surface, the Ashford empire appeared flawless, untouchable, exactly the kind of facade you'd expect from intergenerational wealth built on secrets. But beneath that polished surface were threads waiting to be tugged. Shell companies that paid contract fees with no clear purpose. Shipping routes where cargo volume in manifest logs didn't match declared value. International transfers to accounts in tax havens. Overpayments on consulting services. These discrepancies were the kind that accountants like me smell before they become patterns. I paused and called Linda, my former colleague still active at her firm. She picked up on the first ring. "Linda, I need help," I said softly. I walked her through the wedding spill, the invitation to consult for Ashford, and the first handful of odd entries. Her tone was cautious. "What you're chasing is dangerous," she warned, "but it's also exactly what people like you are supposed to chase." I told her I needed someone with access to industry databases, tools I no longer use daily, someone to cross-reference transactions across jurisdictions. She agreed, under one condition: discretion. We returned to our old pact. You never ask where the trail starts. I never judge how it begins. Meanwhile, David called. He sounded nervous, hesitant. "Mom, Vanessa's father wants to meet with you next week, over lunch." He paused. "He says he wants to make things right. Start again." I nodded silently to myself. "Is that right?" I said aloud. "Well, I'll be honored to see him." He sounded relieved. "Good. I'll send the time." We hung up. I stared at my screen. The Ashford parentage extending into real estate holdings, charitable foundations, Cayman trusts, everything coalesced into one looming shadow, power so tightly held that even their accountants seemed oblivious or complicit. The next day, I received the bill from the rental company, $57,000, liquid damage charge, beadwork repairs, a loss of future value. I paid it without hesitation. The message needed to be clear. You can't humiliate me and expect silence. Then I submitted my consulting acceptance letter to Ashford Industries. On paper, it was polite, eager, innocuous. But the contract they sent back was too limiting. Access only to domestic operations, no international, no shipping ledgers. That clause was carefully built to exclude the parts I already suspected carried the truth. I refused. When Ashford pushed, I declined to sign. Their faces flickered. They had underestimated me yet again. And in that reaction, I saw the gate open just a crack. That evening, I sat in my study, documents scattered like battlefield plans. The phone rang. It was Linda with a patch of gold. A subsidiary company in the Caribbean had a transaction shifting millions from declared value to outlet buyers without substance. The pattern looked choreographed. I didn't call David yet. I didn't warn him, not until I knew for sure what side he was on. Instead, I leaned back and whispered to myself, the war has begun, and it would not end quietly. In the days after I declined Ashford's limited consulting agreement, I felt a shift in the air, subtle, like a breeze turning direction. They were reacting, probing, testing how far I would push. I began with small moves, nothing overt. I sent emails asking benign questions. I'd like to review Project 12's shipping ledger for last quarter. Could you share the operating margins for the Caribbean division? Each inquiry was couched in curiosity, in wanting to be helpful, but I watched faces when I asked. Vanessa's smile was too bright. Richard's eyes flickered. The men in suits shifted in their seats. Meanwhile, I tracked social media and private records discreetly. Vanessa's charitable organizations, Maritime Heritage, International Trade Education, Caribbean Development Initiative, began to look like shells. Their websites were vague. Their balance sheets showed millions in donations, but very little evidence of programs or beneficiaries. That got Linda and me excited. One evening, she called through encrypted lines. "Margaret, I found something in the 2019 ledger of Ashford Maritime Solutions, a cargo declared through Charleston, value listed $12 million, but customs records show only $8 million declared. That's a $4 million gap." She paused. "And that's just for one route. The pattern repeats in 3 other ports." I pressed my palms against my desk. That gap, small in the scope of billions but huge in that one document, was the thread I needed to pull. I waited until dinner time, then called David. "Mom, everything okay?" he asked, voice hesitant. "Yes, sweetheart, just some work things I need to review." "I'm going to that lunch your father arranged with Richard." "Yes, about that," David said. "Vanessa's father told me this is work-level stuff, not personal. He says he wants to involve you in due diligence." His tone was eager, oblivious. "Good," I said. I meant it. The deeper I got, the more careful I would be. The lunch meeting at Romano's was a performance worthy of a stage. Richard greeted me with affable warmth, offered me wine, which I declined, and launched into details about the projects he wanted me to consult on, all innocuous, all seemingly legitimate. He slid a manila folder across the table. "Here are the initial contracts. Nothing too serious, domestic logistics, operational assessments." But I thought, Maybe you want to look overseas too." He paused. "If that is acceptable to you." I looked down casually, flipped through the documents. The first few pages were indeed mundane. Office supply chain analysis, staffing efficiency, standard stuff. But then I saw an appendix, shipping manifest summaries, vaguely described cross-border transfers. "This is interesting," I said quietly. "Would your legal department mind if I took a closer look at some of the international manifests too?" Richard's smile faltered for just a microsecond. When he didn't respond immediately, I let the silence fill the room. He recovered. "I'm sure we can accommodate that in a later phase." He offered a different folder. "But let's start here, in scope." I nodded, shook his hand, left the meeting with a carefully measured expression. In the car, I exhaled so hard I felt my lungs tremble. The man had already flinched. He had felt me. Over the next few days, I turned my attention inward. I re-reviewed every document he gave me, cross-referenced subsidiaries, looked up shell registrations, scanned offshore registries. I found something else. In the contract attachments, one of the shipping subsidiaries had an address in the British Virgin Islands, tied to a trust in Cayman Islands. Another listed the same CEO as a different branch, the same name in two different legal structures. That's textbook layering. I kept my communications light with David. I didn't mention the gaps or the offshore names. He was still newlywed, still believing that wealth and legacy were things to be embraced, not questioned. I couldn't frighten him, but tensions started to surface. Vanessa asked me in a group chat, "Mom, any suggestions for the charity gala next month?" She was fishing, testing me. I replied with a generic suggestion about transparency and reporting. Careful, mild. I watched the read receipts, then silence. At home, I pored over the wine-stained gown again. Its remnants were a reminder, a call to arms. I sat at my desk late into the night, connecting shipping logs to offshore accounts to charitable payments. The network grew, the threads linked. The image of Vanessa humbling me in public became less a social slight and more the opening gambit in a high-stakes chess match. One afternoon, as I worked, my phone rang. It was David. "Mom," he said, voice low, "something strange. Vanessa's father called and said he wants to alter that consulting contract you signed. More limitations, less access, and I think they suggested your services might be redundant." He paused. He said it politely, but I heard something else underneath. My heart tightened. Good, I thought. He's starting to sense it. "I'll handle it," I replied evenly. "Let them play their hand. I'll respond carefully." After the call, I leaned back, finger tracing a line in the air. They were pushing, testing limits, seeing how far I'd push before folding. That's when I drafted the first of many memos, requests to see customs manifests, contract addenda, audit trails, each request cloaked in professionalism, inquisitive, not confrontational. The smaller requests came back with redactions. Some were denied, others came with delays. But with each delay, I learned. With each redaction, I noted the missing pieces. I mapped them. I built a dossier. I also began watching them, watching Vanessa's moves, her social media posts, her vacations, her charity announcements. I tracked signature styles, timing of transactions. In one post, she uploaded a photo of a plaque in a new educational center with her name on it, a donation she claimed. I pulled the image, examined the foundation listed on a tax report. Nothing matched, no address, no transparency. I felt power returning, not the kind delivered in shouts, but the kind built in secrets, in knowledge, in knowing that tomorrow I might hold a card no one expected me to have. One late night, I called Linda. "I think I found the core, the shell holding the shell, a trust under Ashford that owns the shipping manifests database. Vanessa may own none of it, but she controls the optics." She sounded exhausted. "So how big is the network?" I asked softly. A pause. "Margaret, it's massive. Larger than we thought. But you already know that." I stared at maps on my screen, dots of cargo movement, fund flows, tax havens. It glowed like a constellation of crime. I sat back and whispered, "Let them try to stop me now." Because tomorrow night, I'd play a move that would force them to reveal themselves, or concede. And by then, there'd be no hiding. Night after night, I sat beneath the halo of my desk lamp, maps, spreadsheets, financial filings, shell company rosters strewn across my workspace. My mind sharpened into one single purpose: expose Ashford's hidden heart and force it to bleed truth. I started by cross-referencing every subsidiary named in the consulting documents with offshore registries. One name kept surfacing: Ashford Maritime Holdings Limited, registered in the British Virgin Islands, with a nominal CEO that also appeared on a maritime logistics solutions branch in the Bahamas. The same name, different shell, the same fingerprint hidden behind corporate smoke. Then came the breakthrough. I found a chain of internal emails leaked through a shadow server, cargo discrepancies flagged, transfer to trust account pending, move funds before customs audit. The memos were unsigned, but time-stamped and routed through Ashford internal servers. In short, someone inside was aware, someone inside was hiding, and I now held their whispers. I printed everything. 6 pages. One glaring red line kept running across multiple documents. A $4 million shipment discrepancy in Charleston, matched again in Jacksonville, again in Miami, under different shell names. And in each case, funds mysteriously redirected to an account under Vanessa's charitable trust. Heart-pounding, I called Linda. "I found them, the core. They're laundering money through their charity branches." Her voice trembled with tension. "This is bigger than we thought. These are criminal acts." She paused. "You have enough to bring this to a regulator, maybe the feds." I swallowed hard. That was the plan. But I couldn't yet risk pulling the trigger. Not until David was ready. Not until our case was airtight. One mistake, one misstep, one slip, and they'd bury me in legal threats, smear campaigns, or worse. I spent the next 3 days quietly working inside the system. I asked innocuous questions in meetings about shipping logs. I volunteered to run internal audits of smaller branches. I studied each document they handed me. I watched the reactions. Vanessa's eyes fluttered when I mentioned sea routes. Richard's jaw tightened when I asked about offshore reconciliation. Every gesture, every silence, a clue. One evening, as I sat reviewing messages, a notification pinged on my phone. David was texting me. "Vanessa is furious about the contract. She says you asked too many questions. Beneath it, are you overstepping?" I felt a pang. He was trying to protect her, or perhaps to protect us both from danger he didn't yet understand. I typed back, "I'm just doing my job. Promise you, no steps taken until you're fully aware." He read it instantly. The next afternoon, I arranged a casual lunch meeting with Richard at his office. I asked to review some overseas shipping manifests to understand volume trends. On the surface, it seemed respectful, curious. But I watched him sweat. I watched his false assurance crack. I watched him move contracts aside, avoid my eye. He offered teas and water, stiff politeness. I asked a question about the Ashford Charitable Foundations. He spoke broadly, gave generic details. But then I pressed, "And how many grants went to active programs? How many to true beneficiaries?" He hesitated. The hesitation was a confession I pocketed. After lunch, I walked past the big windows of his office, my reflection overlaid with his, the predator and the prey. Because I wasn't naive, I was baiting him, testing his walls, waiting for cracks. That night, I sat back and assembled the leaks and gaps into a dossier: the email chain, the manifest discrepancies, the shell companies, the charitable trust transfers, the internal hesitations. I labeled pages with colors: red for undeniable, orange for suspicious, yellow for context. I put it all into a binder I'd later call the Ashford Portfolio. Linda called again. I've got regulatory contacts ready, SEC, DOJ links. But once you push, there's no going back. They'll come for you, your son, your life. She whispered. You ready? I touched the wine stain on my dress, the memory of that moment still bitter, still fueling me. Yes, I told her. I'm ready. The next morning, Richard's assistant emailed me, per Mr. Ashford's request, please suspend inquiries into international operations until next quarter. That was their first overt move, a containment order. But too late. They were already caught in the spider's web. I replied back with a single line, I will continue to review what I've been legally contracted to review. Then, without fanfare, I forwarded pages of my dossier to Linda, to trustworthy federal contacts, to journalists I trusted, but left nothing wide open. Everything had layers. Everything had contingency. When evening came, I sat in the quiet of my garden, the scent of lavender calming me, my phone silent, my resolve solid. I had become what Vanessa underestimated, not a widow in designer clothes, but a force she couldn't predict, a strategist she couldn't read. And soon she would see how fully I understood the game she began, because the real reveal was yet to come. The day had come. I felt its weight from first light. The moment I would force Ashford to react, to reveal whether their empire was built on the shifting sands of lies or the unshakable foundation of dark deeds. By late afternoon, I had every piece in place. The Ashford Portfolio binder, sealed envelopes of supporting documents, a discreet copy sent to Linda's regulatory contact at the Department of Justice, and one quiet phone call to a trusted journalist. That evening, the Ashford family hosted a dinner in honor of the consulting arrangement, a gesture meant to show cordiality before our formal work began. The room glowed with crystal, succulent dishes, artful lighting. Guests in tuxedos and gowns murmured as I entered, dressed in neutral elegance. Nothing flamboyant, nothing overt. Richard greeted me cordially. He offered a wine glass, but I accepted only water. Vanessa fluttered beside him, radiant and regal. I nodded politely to Lorraine, shaking hands with distinguished-looking guests as I passed. The stage was set. During dinner, small talk flowed, shipping trends, philanthropic work, planned expansions. Vanessa praised my role in helping them streamline logistics. I smiled, listened, asked a few casual questions. Then, just as the main course was served, I stood. Please excuse me, I said, voice steady, calm. The room hushed. Eyes turned. Forks paused in mid-air. I gestured to the servers to pause serving. I'd like to share something with all of you. I held up the first envelope. This binder contains manifest discrepancies, internal memos, shell company structures, and financial transfers tied to charitable trusts. Documents that show how millions moved off the books, how cargo was undervalued, how accounts were rerouted to hidden entities. A ripple ran through the room. Richard's face stiffened. Vanessa's smile faltered. A few guests glanced at each other uneasily. I continued. These documents were compiled from data you provided me, voluntarily still under consulting scope. That scope, Mr. Ashford, attempted to limit me to domestic operations. But as these papers show, the real story lies in international shipping, tax haven trusts, and routes that obscure more than they deliver. I laid the envelope on the table, the pages spilling. I tapped the binder. I will submit these records to regulators and law enforcement unless you voluntarily answer for them right now. Silence. The clink of silverware, the hush that happens when people realize a mask has slipped. Richard's voice, once smooth, now clipped. Margaret, this is a breach of trust, of confidentiality. He gestured toward me. You agreed to a consulting role. I shook my head. I agreed to consult. I did not agree to be complicit, and those documents do not breach confidentiality. They expose wrongdoing. You attempted to limit my access to the very information I have revealed tonight. That limitation was not a boundary. It was a gag. Those redactions you made in documents, they hid crimes, not mistakes. Guests murmured, forks lowered. Vanessa's eyes gleamed with panic. Richard swallowed. You're making a spectacle. This is not how agreements are resolved. I smiled gently. Spectacle. This is transparency. This is accountability. You invited me in to consult. Now I'm consulting the public. I paused. You have two choices. Answer the questions directly, or I hand over this binder to the authorities tonight. He turned to Vanessa. Her face drained of color. Vanessa stood up, voice tight. Mom, Margaret, what are you doing? People will think you're being vindictive. I looked her square in the eye. You chose to humiliate me in public. I've chosen to respond in public. If you think this is revenge, fine. But that revenge is fueled by revealed truth. A tall man at the table, a prominent investor guest, stood and cleared his throat. Excuse me, Miss Turner. Madam Turner? Perhaps we step aside, review privately? But I shook my head. No. If wrongdoing is hidden behind private walls, it will always be hidden. I looked at David across the table. His face was tense, conflicted. I said softly, Son, you deserve the full, honest picture, not a sanitized version. That was enough. Richard rose, voice raised. You've broken our contract. You're threatening our family publicly. You promised discretion. I raised a hand. I promised loyalty to truth, not to crimes. He swallowed hard, red-faced. Guests shifted. Someone whispered. Vanessa sank back into her chair. Before he could retaliate further, the journalist I had contacted earlier stood. I'm with the Chronicle. I requested this evening to be present for transparency. I've copies of select documents ready to publish unless you address them now. The directive cracked open the evening's facade. Cameras pulled closer. Phones came out. The dinner, once a showcase of elite dignity, became a crucible of accountability. Richard slumped. Guests murmured. Vanessa's composure cracked. Her mascara smudged slightly. The man beside her leant in to whisper. Others shifted uncomfortably. I gathered my composure. The wine-stained gown was forgotten. In that moment, I was no longer a victim. I was a witness, a strategist, a person who had turned a humiliation into leverage. I ended quietly. Tonight isn't about vengeance. It's about consequences, and you invited me to see how far it would go. Good evening. I walked out. The click of my heels echoed. The murmur of conversations swelled behind me. Cameras flashed. Outside, I felt the cold night air hit my skin. I exhaled. This was the moment I had waited for, the moment when the Empire would respond. Whether they crumbled or counterattacked, they had no choice now but to show their hand, and I was ready. I stepped away from the dining room, cool night air touching my face, and behind me a storm began to build. The carefully curated world of Ashford Industries, one of wealth, prestige, and secrets, was cracking at the seams. Inside, the hall erupted in anxious voices. Guests whispered. Cameras flashed. Vanessa's face turned from regal control to shock. Richard Ashford's composure wavered. The journalist from the Chronicle, the one I had invited, positioned up front, already phone in hand. The binders of documents lay exposed on the table, no longer hidden. David rose slowly, conflicted, eyes darting. Vanessa stood too, mouth open. The room was suspended between chaos and clarity. I emerged into the corridor, heart steady, though adrenaline throbbed beneath skin. A few feet away, Richard's assistant hurried toward me. Mrs. Turner, please. This is a misunderstanding. Let us handle this diplomatically. I turned to her with a calm smile. There is no misunderstanding. Tonight, light was cast where everything existed in shadow. Back in the room, Richard managed to compose himself. "This is breach of contract," he announced, voice raised but shaky. "Ladies and gentlemen, I ask your patience while we resolve this privately." But his plea rang hollow. The genie was out of the bottle. Within hours, word of the documents and the dinner confrontation had begun leaked. I received a call from Linda. Regulatory agents had taken notice. The wind had shifted. Ashford's internal legal force mobilized. Emails from financial regulators pinged my inbox. The next morning, daytime news outlets splashed the story. Mother-in-law exposes Ashford scandals at wedding dinner. Headlines full of shock, intrigue, and moral outrage. I sat in my kitchen, sipping tea, watching scrolls of accusations, counterstatements, and questions about how much of the empire was legal. Then came the knock on the door. Federal agents entered. Crisp suits, identification badges. They asked to speak with me. I invited them into the study where the binder lay, open to the manifest discrepancies. Their eyes widened just slightly. They asked questions I expected, not the ones I feared. They asked for reproduction rights. They asked for context. They asked how I obtained documents. I answered truthfully, through my consulting role, through public filings, through professional analysis, through care, precision, and above all, conviction. Meanwhile, David was beside himself. He asked to see me that afternoon. When he arrived, he looked tired, older. He said, "Mom, is it true? All of it? Did my wife really use our wedding to humiliate you? Did her family really hide all that?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, and more than we saw tonight. But I did this not to shame you, but to show reality." He looked away, voice tight. I believed, I trusted her. I never thought she'd stoop so low. There was heartbreak in his eyes, betrayal, confusion, but also, I hope, a shift. In the days that followed, legal action unfolded. Ashford's internal counsel fired back with counterclaims, defamation threats, suits for breach of confidentiality. Vanessa issued a statement. The documents were manipulated, the dinner a public stunt by me. I let them talk. I let them scream. I continued sending full unredacted records to regulators. I worked with Linda and my regulatory contacts to ensure the chain of custody was impeccable. I traced the shell companies further. I dug months deeper into financial ledgers. Then came the trial, U.S. versus Ashford Industries. The courtroom became a new battleground. The prosecution laid out manifest discrepancies, offshore account flows, shell entities, charitable trusts tied to shipping payments. I sat in the gallery with David in the row ahead of me. His eyes were fierce now, aligned, protective, no longer mesmerized. Vanessa testified. Her lawyer tried the angle of naive daughter-in-law dragged into dark family secrets. He questioned my motives, casting me as the scorned mother-in-law. But I remained composed, factual. The evidence was overwhelming. On cross-examination, her defenses unraveled. She claimed ignorance of her own organizations. She deferred to her father. She contradicted her statements under financial scrutiny. The jury watched. The judge frowned. The moment that sealed the case came when Vanessa was asked to name beneficiaries of her charitable programs. None existed. Her voice cracked. The silence in the room was deafening. Verdict: guilty on multiple counts. Richard Ashford, Vanessa, and co-conspirators were convicted. The empire toppled. Their veneer of legitimacy crumbled in the public record. After the verdict, in the hush of dissolution, David came to me. Michael's hands shook. "You were right," he said. "You saved me from an empire built on lies." He embraced me, a hug long overdue. This was the climax of everything I had prepared, calculated, fought for. It was more than a vindication. It was proof that even in a world where power hides behind wealth, truth can still demand its day in court. In that moment, before the lights dimmed, I realized the wine was never the weapon. The truth was, and when you know how to use it, you can bring down the highest towers. The courtroom's echoes of guilty still reverberated through my bones when I walked out. Outside, cameras flashed. Reporters jockeyed for questions. The Ashford name, once synonymous with prestige, now floated in disgrace. They had built empires with secrets. I had toppled them with truth. David met me at the courthouse exit. He looked older, his eyes heavier, his shoulders more squared, his expression steely. He didn't smile. He simply leaned into me. We stood there, surrounded by chaos, and I finally let myself cry. Not tears of pain, tears of release. In the days following, everything shifted. Vanessa and Richard were taken into custody. Subpoenas flew. Banks froze accounts. Ashford Industries plunged under investigations by multiple federal agencies. The world watched. Media called it a fall from grace and one of the biggest corporate exposés of the decade. I watched those headlines with neither pride nor vengeance, but with a solemn knowing that justice had at last met arrogance. But my role wasn't over. David was bruised, angry, broken in places, needing someone to anchor him. I moved into his home for several nights, cooking simple dinners, sorting through his paperwork, helping him separate the world he thought he knew from the shattered shell it became. He asked questions he didn't want to hear. He confronted truthful horrors about the in-laws he'd married into. He looked at me sometimes and asked, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I said, "I needed proof first. I needed to be able to stand in front of you with certainty, not accusations." He listened, slowly. Over the next few weeks, lawyers on both sides dove into every contract, every subsidiary, every shipment record. I testified for 6 hours. I walked the jury through shell companies, charitable trusts, offshore accounts, internal memos I had uncovered. The defense lawyers tried to label me as vengeful, as a spiteful mother-in-law, but the evidence was structured, logical, meticulous. They could twist rhetoric. They could attack motive, but they could not deny the numbers, the paper trail, the corroborations. David sat 3 rows ahead of me in the gallery. At times, I caught him wiping his eyes. At times, I saw his jaw clench as he processed how much he had been deceived. When he looked at me, I saw pain, but I also saw resolve forming, a young man remade from his own naivety. After the guilty verdicts, the sentencing hearings began. Richard Ashford received 45 years in federal prison. Vanessa got 25. Other co-conspirators, varying degrees of sentences. The media lit up. Financial regulators imposed penalties, seizing assets, liquidating shell companies. Elements of the Ashford empire collapsed. The heirs had nothing left but their names. In the weeks after, David and I had lunch at Romano's, the same restaurant where Richard had tried to charm me into compliance. He pushed 2 menus across the table. I accepted. We sat in silence for a moment. He looked up. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. I thought. I looked back at my wine glass. I thought of the wrecked dress, of the humiliation, of what it took to bring this down. I could have walked away. I chose not to. "No," I said finally. "None. Because this wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming dignity. It was about protecting you. It was about making a statement. Power built on lies cannot hold." He nodded slowly. He looked at me as though seeing me anew, as someone who had been underestimated for years, now fully revealed. Over time, we began to heal. David regained his confidence. He severed financial ties that tied him to the Ashford schemes. He cooperated with prosecutors, gave testimony. He rebuilt his life based on integrity. I, too, rebuilt my own identity. I returned to consulting and forensic work, but carefully. I turned down flashy contracts. I took cases that mattered. I mentored young accountants who wanted to probe deeper, to build careers beyond the numbers, careers where integrity mattered more than profit. One evening, as we sat in my garden watching twilight settle, David asked, "Mom, do you think she understood what she did was wrong?" "Vanessa, did she ever realize she threw wine on more than your dress?" I turned to him, memory flickering. Maybe, maybe not. But whether she did or not doesn't erase the fact that someone needed to expose it. He nodded. We fell silent, listening to cicadas and shadows moving across lawn. The world was quieter now, safer in a way. Yes, the Ashford Empire had been dismantled, but the real victory felt silent. The restoration of truth in our lives, the redemption in code and contract, the rebuilding of trust between mother and son. Because sometimes the strongest work begins after the trial, when the real casualties are the hearts of those you love and those you protect. And so we began again, carefully, truthfully, together. The courtroom verdict was history. The Ashford Empire had crumbled, and yet the real work was just beginning, not in lawsuits or headlines, but in healing, rebuilding, and defining what comes after justice. In the months following the trial, David and I retreat into a quieter rhythm. He moved into the house I had occupied. We filled the quiet rooms with conversations about what it means to trust again. We talked less about Ashford and more about life, what he wants, who he is, and who he wants to become. One evening, we sat in the living room by the fire. He asked me, "Mom, did you ever imagine it would end like this?" Not with a wedding, but with a courtroom? I folded my fingers, eyes tracing the shadows in the room. "No," I answered, "but I always believed truth had power. I always believed that someone who underestimated me would eventually regret it." He nodded. "I was in love. I wanted to believe in a fairy tale, but you gave me something better. You gave me clarity and a second chance to choose differently." That night, I went up to my old closet, saw that dress I never wore again. The wine-stained, ruinous dress that started it all wasn't a memory I wanted to keep. I boxed it, not to hold on to the trauma, but to bury what once humiliated me. A symbol, yes, but now a marker of transformation. Over time, we reconnected with family, friends, colleagues. David slowly rejoined his old life, small clients, small projects, rebuilding his agency from the ground up. He refused handouts from the fortune that had caused so much pain. Instead, he leaned on honesty, trust, and hard work. I continued consulting, taking on cases that mattered: hidden fraud in small companies, nonprofit irregularities, investigative work nobody else wanted. I helped people who didn't have fortunes, who didn't have resources, and I found purpose in that. In one meeting, a young CEO told me, "You changed how I think about power." I realized then that my journey had become more than a personal vendetta. It became proof that knowledge, persistence, and integrity can shatter systems built on deception. The public and media eventually moved on to the next scandal. Ashford's downfall became a case study in corporate criminality. But for David and me, the wounds remained. Trust is fragile. Once shattered, even the clearest truths take time to rebuild in the heart. One spring afternoon, I received an invitation, elegantly scripted, from Vanessa's attorney, offering a mediated conversation. David asked me what I wanted to do. I paused. Then I said, "I want to close the chapter, but only if it doesn't crack open old wounds." At the meeting, I sat across from her. She was thinner, more reserved. The weight of consequences had softened her confidence. She spoke of mistakes, of regrets, of not realizing the darkness she walked into. She apologized, not for all, but for some. I listened, and I replied simply, "You threw wine on more than a dress that day. You threw wine on trust. But apologies don't erase wrongdoing. They may be the first brick toward something else." What you build next is your choice. I hope what you build is better than what you destroyed. She nodded. We parted. No reconciliation, no embrace, but perhaps closure. Years later, as I sit in my garden, the scent of roses drifting in twilight, I reflect on the path we walked. I remember the humiliation, the calculation, the trial, the rebuilding. I remember wine and trials and power and secrets laid bare. If someone asked me, "What's your single greatest lesson from all this?" I'd say this: respect is not given because of wealth, title, or appearances. Respect is earned, maintained by integrity and truth, and defended with courage when necessary. If you humiliate someone, you open a door, and in walking through that door, you risk entering a room you never meant to open, one with consequences, revelations, reckonings. I made that journey. I was underestimated. I was humiliated. I was thrown off balance. But I found strength in my skills, my discipline, my persistence. I reclaimed voice, power, dignity, and I helped my son see the person I was, not the caricature she projected. Tonight, I end this story not with vengeance, but with clarity, firm boundaries, and hope. Hope that those who wield power will remember that true strength is never in cruelty. It's in the quiet because it's grounded in truth. So yes, that wedding night became the single turning point of many lives. Vanessa Ashford's biggest mistake was thinking she controlled the narrative. She forgot I understood numbers. And more importantly, I understood human nature. Thank you for following this journey. May it remind you, no mask is permanent. No empire built on lies can stand forever, and the quietest voices often carry the deepest power. If you stayed until the end, you now know this wasn't just about a ruined dress. It was about respect, about truth, about drawing a line and saying, "No more." Vanessa thought she was silencing a harmless woman with a glass of wine. Instead, she awakened a storm. So ask yourself, what would happen if you stopped letting others define your worth? Who would you become if you stood up, not with rage, but with unshakable truth? Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded. The most underestimated people often hold the most dangerous power, knowledge, patience, and nothing left to lose. Comment your thoughts. Subscribe for more life-changing stories. And remember, never mistake silence for weakness. Because this time, the accountant won.